Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. Thank you for connecting with the Pennsylvania Game Commission and joining us for this webinar. My name is Crescinda, and along with my colleague Lori, we will be managing today's webinar. We are fortunate to be joined today by Lauren Ferrari and Dan Lynch from the Pennsylvania Game Commission Southeast Region, as well as Kevin Lutz from the Lancaster County Conservation District. And they are all here today to talk to us about managing farmland for positive crop yields and wildlife. We expect today's presentation to last about 20 minutes, followed by a question and answer period that will last about 10 to 15 minutes. To ask our presenters a question, you can type it into the Type Question Here box on the GoToWebinar control panel that's located at the right of your screen. For those of you dialing in to listen today by phone, please note that this is not a toll-free call and you may receive long-distance charges from your service provider. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our presenters, Lauren, Dan, and Kevin. Thanks for joining us today, and if you'd like to share a little bit about yourself and your position with our attendees before we get started, you can feel free to do so now. Thanks.
Thanks, Crescinda. My name is Lauren Ferrari, and I am the manager at Middle Creek Wildlife Management Area, where I manage the visitor center, the biological operations, and all the controlled hunts there.
Hi, Crescinda. My name is Dan Lynch, and I'm the Wildlife Education Specialist for the Pennsylvania Game Commission in the Southeast region of PA.
And hello, I'm Kevin Lutz. I'm an ag technician with the Lancaster County Conservation District. I work mostly with farmers to develop conservation plans and implement those plans.
So going forward, we're just going to start with the goal for today, and that is to just introduce our visitors to some ideas to help manage their properties for wildlife habitat and to conserve the wildlife on their properties, while also still farming for a sustainable yield. During this presentation, you will see many photos that are taken at Middle Creek Wildlife Management Area, which is owned and operated by the Pennsylvania Game Commission. Middle Creek's habitat management, while primarily focused on wildlife, demonstrates how farming practices and wildlife management can work hand in hand. These photos might inspire ideas of how our viewers can be more wildlife friendly on their property while continuing to farm the land as you have done. Crescinda already introduced us already, but just want to give credit where credit is due for Grant Heilman Photography. They were our photographers for this at Middle Creek, and a special thanks to Sally Gregory at Lancaster County Conservation District for behind-the-scene collaboration and also for initiating the whole process so that you guys can watch this webinar as well. Click this here. Without further ado, we're gonna get started here. So we'll get started with Kevin. Can you please take a moment to describe how a conservation plan is developed, sections of that plan that relate to wildlife, and how landowners can create a conservation plan for their property?
Sure, I can do that. First off, I just have to explain a little bit what a conservation plan is for those of you who may not be familiar, and just talk a little bit about how they are made with working with the farmer. So a conservation plan or an ag E&S plan or erosion and sediment control plan is developed by working with a technician at the Conservation District or the Natural Resources Conservation Service and working with the farmer to look over their entire farm and discuss options to solve any resource concerns that might be on that farm, like areas of erosion or water quality issues or things like that. And there's a lot of different options to solve a problem.
We're having some audio technical difficulties, so just hold on one second.
As our network connection has been reestablished. Hopefully you guys can hear us.
Yes, yeah, we can hear you now.
Sorry about that. Don't know what happened there. So can you guys tell us what the last thing you heard from Kevin was?
He was just about to describe what a conservation plan is.
Okay. Sorry about that. We'll hopefully continue forward here. Won't have any problems. So, all right.
Okay. Well, I apologize if I'm repeating myself for anything that I did say, but I was just describing the difference between a conservation plan and an ag erosion and sediment control plan. The Pennsylvania Clean Streams Law requires an ag E&S plan to be developed for all farms to prevent soil erosion and protect water quality. And this has been required since 1972. And in this plan, it includes best management practices that can be either agronomic or structural that are meant to protect soil and water quality. And many of these practices can either directly or indirectly benefit wildlife, depending on how they're managed. And similarly, a Natural Resource Conservation Service or NRCS conservation plan accomplishes these same goals, but these plans also have a more allowance in them to focus on wildlife on the farm as well. And a conservation plan can be written to meet the same requirements of an ag E&S plan, so either plan can be used to meet the state regulations. With NRCS, however, they work with the farmer on a voluntary basis, usually through requests from the farmer for assistance to solve a resource concern on their farm. And they also have multiple incentive programs for funding and implementing these conservation plans. Also, to participate in many of the USDA Farm Bill programs, a conservation plan is required. Some of the programs that can help incentivize putting in some of these BMPs are EQIP or the Wetland Reserve Program as well. So I'll go into discussing some of the different best management practices that are included in these plans that gets discussed with the farmer and the person writing the plan to see what will work for each individual farm. Every farm is different. So as I mentioned, many BMPs that can be planned in either of these plans protect soil and water quality, and they also can have a benefit to wildlife. And these practices can either provide food, water, space, or a place for the wildlife to reproduce. But most importantly, they can provide cover for wildlife, either in the form of escape cover, reproductive cover, or thermal cover. And I'll just discuss and go through a number of the common best management practices, or BMPs, that can be planned to protect both soil and water quality, but also help wildlife. First off, and one of the more simple practices and more common practices that farmers often choose to have in their conservation plans are cover crops. And cover crops, either in the form of small grains, legumes, or grasses, are planted after the main crop is harvested in the fall to protect soil over the winter and to utilize excess nutrients. But they can also provide benefits to wildlife, either as food or cover. This can very much depend on the planting timing of the cover crops and also how they're terminated, whether the cover crop is harvested in the spring, if it's killed with spray, or if it's plowed under in the spring. Also, if manure is applied during the winter, that can affect how much of a benefit a cover crop is to wildlife. And the timing of any of these, whether it's when the cover crops get planted or when they get harvested, also can vary the benefit to wildlife. Field borders are also another excellent best management practice that can be used to reduce soil erosion by eliminating end rows in crop fields. An end row is a row of crops which can vary in width that's planted at the end of a crop field that allows the farmer to harvest that first and be able to turn in that area when they're moving their equipment through harvesting the rest of the field, or also when they're planting to be able to have a place to turn when they get to the end of the field. It sounds like a very simple thing, but it also can lead to some of the more greater areas of erosion in the field. Even if the rest of the field is planted on the contour, often these end rows are planted up and down the hill, and that can lead to erosion when water follows the rows. So a field border is a permanent strip of grass that's planted next to the crop field at least 35 feet wide. And by planting a field border, it allows the farmer to access the fields and turn the equipment on the field border rather than planting the end rows. It also can serve to reduce wildlife damage to crops by acting as a buffer between the crop field and the adjacent cover. So often crops that are grown next to the woods, for example, have reduced yields due to shading and wildlife pressure. So if a field border is installed, it can be harvested for hay, so you're not losing the yields from planting corn right up to the woods. So there's also an economic benefit there. You're not just giving up some of the crop field for grass. But these field borders can also provide food and cover for many species of wildlife and also beneficial insects depending on what's planted in that field border. Conservation cover or critical area planting is another best management practice where areas with high erosion potential in fields are planted in permanent vegetation. And depending on what species of grasses and forbs are planted, it can benefit various species of wildlife and can enhance the habitat. Contour buffer strips are strips of vegetation that are planted between crop fields to break up the slope and water runoff in the fields to prevent erosion. And these areas can be also managed to benefit wildlife based on what kind of vegetation is selected and the timing of the mowing of these buffers. Similarly, a filter strip, which is usually planted at the bottom of a field, at the field edge, to usually protect a stream or another sensitive area from sediment entering those areas, that can also be managed to benefit wildlife. Strip cropping, another fairly simple practice that can be done, is planting alternating strips of row crops with close growing crops like hay, and it can provide habitat throughout the crop field landscape rather than just having a monoculture of all one crop. So think of a crop field all planted in corn versus that same field being broken up into evenly spaced strips of corn and hay, where once the corn is harvested, the hay is still there. So not only do the hay strips provide shelter when the other crops are being harvested, but they also provide cover in the winter months. And delaying mowing of these hay strips or some of the other practices I mentioned, like the contour buffer strips or the filter strips, can provide nesting habitat for wildlife as well. If a farm has pastures on the farm, prescribed grazing or grazing management is another simple practice that can be done to prevent overgrazing and the formation of barrier areas that can lead to soil erosion. This can be accomplished through rotating livestock through various paddocks or smaller pastures broken up within the larger pasture, or by limiting stocking rates, so the number of livestock that's on each pasture, or by fencing out sensitive areas. And grassland wildlife can benefit by delaying grazing in some portions of the pasture until after the nesting season, or by not overgrazing grass to leave additional cover over the winter. If streams are found on the farm, simply fencing the livestock out of the stream can provide obvious benefits for wildlife while preventing stream bank erosion. But you can provide additional benefits by adding buffer areas around the stream, which I think is going to be discussed later in the presentation. And those buffers can be either herbaceous covers, which would be grass, or they could be riparian forested buffers, which we planted in trees and shrubs. And either one of those can enhance water quality and provide habitat for wildlife. All of these practices can be planned in either type of the plan, so either a conservation plan or an Ag E&S plan, because they all solve soil erosion issues or water quality. But some practices can be planned in conservation plans that directly benefit wildlife and can be funded by various programs. Forest stand improvement is one practice that can improve timber value on farm woodlots, but the practice can also be tailored to wildlife habitat management for specific species that the farmer or landowner may want to help. So if you want to increase the amount of deer on your farm, you can do that. If you want to increase squirrels or whatever kind of wildlife you want to provide more habitat for, that practice is very wide in scope, so you can sort of tailor it to what you want to do on your property. The same is true for upland wildlife habitat management. That can be anywhere from planting grass areas to managing those grass areas in certain ways, or providing homes for wildlife. And even wetland restoration can be planned. So if there's an area that tends to lay wet in the crop field that you don't really get much yield off of, you could plan to restore a wetland in that spot and use an area that you may not be getting much yield off of to provide other benefits for wildlife. So when developing a conservation plan, the Pennsylvania NRCS has developed a wildlife habitat worksheet that evaluates the habitat that is currently on the farm, and you can also look at practices that you're planning to implement and how that's going to improve the wildlife habitat on the farm. There's a separate worksheet, as you can see on the screen here, for cropland and then also for hayland and pasture, because each are looked at in different ways and different practices that you can do to improve the wildlife habitat. For cropland, factors like crop rotation, crop residue management, field borders, and field size, and also the proximity to permanent cover all help determine what can be done to increase wildlife habitat on the farm. Pasture and hayland is evaluated differently, looking at grazing or harvest management, types of grasses and forbs that are planted in the pasture or the hayfield, the field size, and also the proximity to permanent cover. And points on either form are added up to determine an index score, and you can look at what practices you're planning to do to see what you can do to increase that index score. An index score of less than 0.5 does not meet NRCS's standards or criteria for wildlife habitat, so planning practices to increase that score would mean more wildlife habitat on the farm. So I know you can't really see the details too well on those two pictures on the screen, but I just want to touch on a few of the simple practices that you may already be doing on the farm, or different management that's already being done that can either impact or improve wildlife habitat that you really don't think about on a regular basis. So just looking under crop rotation, if a crop is grown, a continuous row crop, or just corn silage and alfalfa, that's on the lower end of the scale, so that has the least amount of wildlife value. But if you go up to the upper end of the scale where you're planting small grains and row crops mixed with hay, and the first cutting of hay is not for haylage, so it's a delayed harvest, that gives you the highest points. So just in between there, planting a cover crop that isn't being harvested for silage, and reducing tillage are all simple practices that you can do to increase the wildlife benefits on the farm. As I mentioned, crop residues, like having a cover crop, and how you manage that cover crop, whether it's planted using no-till, if it's harvested for feed, or if it's just left undisturbed, can all provide wildlife habitat benefits. And just skipping down to the field size and the field border, that has a big impact, because fields that have woodland or fence rows around the fields that the farmer is also managing can increase the wildlife habitat, because the wildlife has escape cover and places to go when the fields are fully harvested. The same would go for the pastures, which would be the evaluation on the right. That's looking at more so delaying in grazing or delaying in mowing. Again, I think will be talked about a little bit later on here, but just doing that to give more nesting cover for grassland birds, for example, can have a big impact on wildlife habitat. Also, the grass composition. So if it's all introduced grasses like tall fescue or reed canary grass, that has lower wildlife value. But if your pastures or grass fields have orchard grass, that's a little bit more value. But if you have mixed native grasses with some other warm season grasses and cool season grasses, that provides a greater benefit because there's more variety. Also, having forbs mixed in with your grasses provides more habitat and more food for wildlife. And then also, same as with the cropland, if you have smaller pastures or areas that are closer to other wildlife cover, that obviously has more benefit as well. So if you look at just simple things that you can do on the farm to increase habitat, whether you intentionally want to manage for certain types of wildlife, or if you just want to do small things to benefit wildlife overall with creating more habitat, you can see there's a lot of small things that you can do to do that.
All right, thank you, Kevin. And we're going to go
Hang on, Lauren. I think we lost you again. Hang on 1 second. Lauren and Dan, Kevin, can you hear me talking? Okay, stand by, everybody. We're figuring this out.
Sorry, don't know why this keeps happening. We apologize. Hopefully you guys can hear us.
Yes, we can hear you now. You're all good.
Okay.
Go ahead.
All right. When technology doesn't work. So we're going to keep moving forward here and talk about specifically a few things that Kevin has mentioned a little bit in more detail. So he did talk about mowing and why the time of year when you actually mow your pastures or haylands matters. So if you are managing or your croplands primarily for pasture or hay, the goals for you are to cost effectively establish and maintain these lands to furnish a high quality forage yield and to provide adequate soil protection. Pastures and hayfields can support the needs of the farmer for both his livestock and wildlife if there is a plan put in place for the vegetative type and uses. So planting fields in a mixture of both warm and cool season grass mixes, as Kevin had mentioned, can provide both forage for livestock and cover for wildlife. In addition to what vegetation to plant, timing of cutting is also of importance. If you're focusing on pasture land or lower quality mulch hay, delaying mowing or haying until early to mid-August, if possible, will ensure the survival of game species such as fawns, wild turkeys, and upland birds, but also a variety of grassland nesting birds, many of which are in decline. But when cutting for higher quality forage hay, timing is also of importance. Timing the first mowing around the beginning of May and continuing to mow roughly once a month, depending on growing conditions, will prevent birds from nesting in the hay and will reduce the harm to grassland nesting birds, game birds, or fawns that might be dropped in June. Putting a little thought into the timing of your mowing schedule will prevent unnecessary deaths for wildlife and help keep nests from disturbance over the summer. Last but not least, when mowing, consider escape corridors for wildlife and also leaving refuge areas closer to the tree lines or adjacent fields. Looking at these slides here, the left photo was a photo taken at Middle Creek where we specifically manage for geese, so those fields are constantly mowed for foraging areas for waterfowl. And to the right, you can see a section of field that is not mowed due to the wet and saturated soil. This soil here lies really wet throughout the growing season and is not taken for hay to help create a buffer between the cut hay field and the woods. This creates a softer edge effect and therefore will increase the biodiversity of wildlife while preserving the soil that would otherwise be unproductive.
Low areas and fields that consistently hold water are ideal areas for breeding waterfowl and create stopover habitat during their migrations. They are also excellent sources of water for many other birds and mammals living in that habitat. Like Kevin said, leaving a 20 to 30 foot or 35-foot buffer of unmowed grasses around this water source will provide needed cover and food for wildlife accessing the wet areas while avoiding erosion.
The pictures on these slides demonstrate a soft or feathered edge that was left unplanted or mowed to create a smoother transition to wooded areas or to create areas of cover for wildlife. These areas that lie wet, as mentioned previously, or areas that cannot be planted for various reasons are great locations to create a feathered edge. In addition to wildlife, pollinators can also utilize these areas. Pollinators such as bats, bees, birds, butterflies, and other insects can help to increase your crop yield depending on what you are planting. In addition to the feathered edges or soft edge effect demonstrated in these photos, we're also showing you an easy tool that landowners can maintain on their property for increased wildlife viewing, which are nest boxes. The bluebird boxes shown in the right picture can be utilized as homes for both bluebirds and tree swallows, which are both insect-loving species. This involves a cautionary tale, however. Many farmers use pesticides on their property to increase yield. Considerations of the negative impacts to not only to the insects but other wildlife on the property should be used when using such pesticides. Not only will insects be reduced and therefore the wildlife that feeds on them, but you also risk harming non-target species such as bluebirds and swallow species and other wildlife that comes in contact with the chemicals.
Upland birds like pheasants and many songbirds require grassland cover areas 12 months of the year, not just during the fall and winter. By leaving edges around hayfields that are usually wet or hard to access with equipment, you will cut down on fuel costs to less productive ground and benefit these types of species. Weeds in your fields like ragweed, pokeweed, beggar's lice, and some goldenrods will provide seeds for birds and small mammals, as well as needed nutritional forbs for animals like deer. At Middle Creek, pollinator fields are planted. Some grassy fields are only mowed on a rotational basis, and the use of controlled burns are just some of the different types of management practices designed to enhance wildlife habitat in an agricultural setting. Snags that border fields and pastures are useful as perches and provide cavities for nests. It has been estimated that dead trees and trees that contain decaying wood provide important habitat for about 25% of the forest wildlife species in the northeastern United States. If a dead or dying tree isn't threatening your residence or a roadway, the Game Commission recommends leaving it to nature and the benefit of wildlife. Dead and dying trees provide nesting habitat for songbirds, owls, ducks, squirrels, and bats, to name a few.
Hang on, we lost you again.
All right. Sorry about that. Let's try to get through this without it happening again. Can you guys hear us okay?
Yes, you're good.
All right, go ahead, Dan.
All right, so we'll get back to where we lost you there. Dead and dying trees provide nesting habitat for songbirds, owls, ducks, squirrels, and bats, to name a few. They also provide homes for insects that attract many bird and mammal species. So if you're into wildlife, then you should be into dead trees.
Perhaps you don't have any snags or the ability, did it say it again? Okay. Perhaps you don't have any snags or the ability to make snags on your property, but you still want to provide wildlife homes, such as the bluebird boxes we previously discussed. Years of research have helped to develop efficient yet successful guidelines for nest boxes for various species. Taking a look at the picture on the left, this nest box is for an American kestrel, which is Pennsylvania's smallest falcon. American kestrels are a species in decline within much of North America. This bird feeds heavily on small birds, rodents, and insects, and are common to find in pasture land or hayfields, but can also take up residence near farm and agricultural buildings. A simple addition of a kestrel box could create a welcoming home for this small falcon. The photo on the right is a wood duck box. If your property lies wet in early spring, or if you have small water impoundments, a wood duck box or other waterfowl nesting structure might be an option to put on your property. These birds hatch in early spring and can utilize farm ponds and wetlands to feed throughout the summer before migrating. American kestrel and wood duck nest box plans, along with plans for other nest boxes, can be found on the Game Commission's website. Wildlife homes are also on sale through the Pennsylvania Game Commission's Howard Nursery. While it seems like a great idea to house wildlife, placing a 10-foot pole in the middle of an agricultural field for a kestrel might be impractical. Instead, some nest boxes like kestrel boxes can work from a building structure as well. Barn owls, which are also a species in decline, can benefit from nest box placement as well. While their box is larger and more horizontal than the kestrels, barn owls are typically considered welcome guests to farmers as they help to control rodent populations on their property. Options for barn owl nest boxes include placing boxes in used or abandoned silos or even in the high rafters of a barn. Sharing the same niche as kestrels, just at a different time of day, both barn owls and kestrels prefer open areas away from trees where there are plenty of open fields and space to hunt. Farmland can be a perfect home for these raptors.
Riparian buffers not only improve water quality, but also provide a natural corridor for wildlife. Riparian buffers, or stream buffers, are areas of vegetation near a stream that are usually forested, which help to shade and partially protect the stream from adjacent land uses. They can play a key role in increasing water quality and therefore provide positive environmental benefits. The photo on the left shows a newly established buffer, including plastic tree protectors placed on newly planted trees. The middle photo shows an established buffer with different plant growth height densities. The photo on the right shows how wildlife utilizes riparian areas as places of cover and movement.
So while our photo tour here has been brief and not without technical issues, we hope that you have been familiarized to various ideas and techniques that you can take back to your property or to discuss with a landowner you know. At this time, Crescinda and Laurie, if you'd like to open it up to questions, we would be happy to answer them as long as our connection decides that it does want to stay here.
Okay, this one's for Kevin. Where can one obtain a copy of the worksheet that you had on one of your previous slides, either online or in a paper form?
Sure. Paper form, you could obtain it from your local conservation district or NRCS office, but it is available online. It's just a little difficult to search for if you don't know how to navigate the site. The Natural Resource Conservation Service, which they are a federal agency, they have a website that's called the Electronic Field Guide for all their conservation practices. And within that guide, you can find a copy of those worksheets. But like I said, if it's simpler to find, contacting your local office for either agency, they'd be able to provide that.
Thanks, Kevin. All right, we have a question here from Heather. She thinks this would make a good live presentation for her agroecology class. So who might she get in touch with to see if that is a possibility? The folks there on the screen?
Well, actually, she could probably get a hold of either agency, either Sally Gregory at the Conservation District or myself, Dan Lynch, and that's DA.Lynch at pa.gov. So it's DALYNCH at pa.gov. Perfect.
Thanks.
All right, and that's all the questions that we have. Some might come in after the fact, but we'll get them to you via email if that's the case. And to everyone else, we're sorry if we weren't able to get to your question, but looks like our box is empty. So this has been a great session with a lot of important information and some good questions. This webinar has been recorded, and everyone who's in attendance will receive an email with a link to the recording within the next few days. The recording will also be uploaded to the Game Commission's YouTube channel. And again, we'd like to thank Lauren, Dan, and Kevin for sharing their expertise and their time with us today. We'd also like to thank all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us this afternoon, and we hope you'll visit us again to learn more about Pennsylvania wildlife in upcoming webinars. Let us know what kind of subjects you might be interested in future webinars. But until then, we hope you're able to get outside and enjoy some of Pennsylvania's great outdoors. Thanks again for joining us.
Thanks, guys. Take care.